So they sent me to Mexico to work on the acquisition and to negotiate. Going through, we started hauling all of these boxes out and going through all these documents. We couldn't take them with us, and so we tried to see if we could copy them. I was somehow supposed to get these back to the United States. I had to take a bus with all of these boxes of documents. It had, pigs and chickens and stuff on the bus. I got to the border at about 1 o'clock in the morning. I hand carried all of these boxes. I ended up hitchhiking with all these boxes. I got to Tucson around 5 o'clock in the morning, and I was able to find somebody to drive me from Tucson to Phoenix.
Hello everyone, welcome to the DJ Sealand's Business Podcast. Today on the show we've got Scott Theobald.
How are you?
Good. Scott, thanks so much for taking the time. It's great to be with you today.
Glad to do it. Nice to be here.
So, I'll tell the people a little bit about you. You're a business attorney.
Right.
And have worked with lots of different businesses. Kind of an ambitious career. Went to Columbia University.
Correct.
So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. I grew up in Salt Lake City. I went on a mission to Central America.
Okay.
I got married right after I came home from my mission, and am happy to report that I'm still married to my wife of now 39 years.
Wow, that's awesome. And you knew her before you left?
I knew her before I left on my mission.
Okay.
I graduated from the University of Utah in 1983. I have 2 bachelor's degrees from the University of Utah, one in civil engineering and one in Spanish.
Wow, okay.
And after I graduated, my wife and I moved to San Francisco, and I worked as an engineer at a big engineering firm called Bechtel Corporation, which is a really large engineering and construction company based in San Francisco. And so I really enjoyed that, but I decided earlier, before I'd ever graduated from college, that I wanted to go to law school. And so my wife and I packed up from San Francisco and moved all the way across the country to New York.
Awesome.
And I went to school in New York. And as you mentioned, I went to Columbia University. I have a law degree and an MBA from Columbia University. And then after I graduated in 1988, we moved to Phoenix, and we've lived in Phoenix ever since.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So what were you like as a kid? Pretty good at school, but like, what would you like to do for fun?
Well, I did all kinds of sports. I did, in high school, I played football, soccer, wrestling, and rugby.
Wow.
and golf, although I didn't play any organized golf. I just liked doing it. Golf and tennis I liked doing just because they were fun.
Oh,
and
awesome.
racquetball. I was very into sports when I was a kid.
Anything with the ball, it sounds like.
What's that?
Anything with the ball.
Anything with the ball. Anything with the ball, and a racket sports. When I got to New York, they don't play racquetball there, they play squash.
Oh, okay.
A lot more than racquetball. And so I actually learned how to play squash while I was in New York, and I played a lot of squash, and I really liked that too.
Cool.
It was a good game. So yeah, I haven't done a whole lot of sports since I've lived in Phoenix because I just haven't had time. I've been kind of busy. I haven't really been much of a golfer since I've lived here too, which is strange because Phoenix is like one of the best places in the world to golf. So
yeah,
go figure.
So what are you doing now, day to day? What does it look like for you?
Well, every day is very different.
Okay.
For example, today I had lunch with a client that wanted to talk about a problem that they face in their business. They have a particular item that they are involved in selling, and each of these items is very expensive, on the order of $1 million or so. And they want to sell one of these items to somebody, but they're not sure that they can pay for it. And so we talked about all the legal solutions for how to arrange things so that when they sell this item to the purchaser, that the purchaser will actually be able to follow through on paying what's owed to purchase the product. So there's a lot that goes into some of those decisions.
Interesting. So how much of that is you understanding the law, and how much is it just you problem solving like in a business?
Well, it's probably about 75% law and about 25% business.
Okay.
Yeah.
So and so you've worked with so many businesses over the years, advising them a lot of times in acquisitions, right?
Right. So one of the things that I do is I work in the area that's called M&A, mergers and acquisitions, and that typically involves one company acquiring another company, purchasing another company, and there's several ways to do that.
Yeah.
They can either buy a company for cash, or they can use their own stock and trade the stock to the other company in exchange for purchasing the other company, or borrow money, or there's lots of different ways to do it actually.
Does it tend to be bigger companies just doing it in cash?
Just depends. Some companies, some even smaller companies that generate a lot of cash flow are able to put enough money in the bank that they just have cash reserves around that they can use to go out and make an acquisition. So yeah, it just depends on the business.
Awesome. So one of the things I was wondering, with all the businesses you're involved in, is there something that keeps on coming up? You're just like, if businesses could just do this, they would solve so many of their problems.
Well, one thing for sure is if businesses kept good records. That's one of the problems.
That's what I was going to guess.
That's one of the problems with small businesses.
Mainly finances?
Well, and corporate records too, like their articles of incorporation and accounting records, because any business is subject to being looked at by, if there's ever a lawsuit, if there's an audit, if there's any kind of an investigation conducted by any government agency, they're always going to ask to look at certain documents that pertain to the corporation.
Yeah.
If it's any kind of a financial thing, they're going to want to look at the accounting records for the company. Okay. And they're going to want to see what payments were made and when and to whom. And similarly, if there's any kind of a government investigation, they want to know things like who are the stockholders, who are the shareholders in the company, and who's the board of directors, and where's all that memorialized in all of the corporate documents for the company. So there's a lot of documentation that goes along with a business, and that's one of the things that lawyers like me are especially focused on, is all that documentation.
Right. So what kind of headaches are you running into when businesses don't do that, or they're a little short on it?
Well, when businesses don't have those, we often are called upon to go back and recreate all of those documents.
Oh, okay.
Or at least some of them, the more important ones that govern how the corporation is controlled, how it's managed. And say, for example, that the board of directors of a company took an action that was an important action, like authorizing a loan or authorizing the issuance of stock. Those things, those types of actions are supposed to be memorialized in writing. They're supposed to be put down in a resolution of the board of directors. But if they didn't do it, then somebody needs to go back probably at some point and recreate all of that paperwork so that those records exist.
Okay.
And that involves kind of solving a big puzzle.
And so how were you able to decide, this is the career path I went on? Because I remember talking to you earlier, and you were getting very creative. You're thinking, maybe I could be an astronaut. You knew you were very capable. So what was your story like? And then also for a lot of the youth out there who aren't sure what they want to do, what is that kind of?
Well, I would say to any young man or young woman who's contemplating what they want to do for a career, for a professional career, they should be realistic about their interests and about their talents, and they should try to assess what they're good at and try to draw some parallels between the things that they naturally are interested in and naturally have talent for, and the types of careers that might correlate to that kind of background. In my case, I was always very strong growing up in math and science. Those were my strongest areas. And so that led me to study engineering because those rely heavily on math and science. But I always, actually, as a missionary, I realized that I enjoyed spending time with people, and I enjoyed things like public speaking, and I enjoyed writing, even though I wasn't a very good writer when I was in college. And so I realized that to become really good at writing in particular, I would need to do a whole lot of it. And that's one thing that lawyers do a whole lot of, is writing. Lawyers write a lot. And finally, after doing it for year after year, I actually became good at it. because anything you do for a long time, hopefully you'll improve at over time. And
do you think you knew you could do that from all your sports experience, where you knew when you practice you could get better?
Well, yeah, I've always had confidence that if I did something long enough that I would get better at it. Mm-hmm. I think most people feel that way. Most people, I think, are just a lot of people are just afraid to try new things.
Yeah.
And that I have a lot of flaws, but that's not one of them. That trying new things is something I've always been up for. I've done a lot of kind of one-time things just to try them out in my life.
You and me both. I just did yoga a few weeks ago.
There you go.
I would never think to do yoga, but it was actually very cool. I'm doing drum lessons now.
Perfect.
I'm not going to be a drummer, but like, I think that's important.
Yeah.
And I think by trying new things, that's how people find out what they're interested in.
That's exactly right, yeah. You need to try a bunch of different things, see what you like, see what you're good at, see what feels comfortable, and see how you enjoy spending your time.
Yeah. So were you an engineer after University of Utah after you graduated?
After college.
But you knew you wanted to be a lawyer, so,
right?
So what made you want to go do the engineering?
Well, I had just spent 4 years in college getting an engineering degree, and I didn't want to go immediately to law school without being an engineer, because I didn't want to feel like I was just kind of throwing away this engineering degree and never actually seeing what it was like to be an engineer. And so it was a really good experience for me to do it. I learned a lot about the business of engineering. I actually learned that I didn't want to be an engineer the rest of my life. In my case, I really enjoyed kind of the study of engineering more than the practice of engineering.
Oh, okay.
And some people, I think it's probably just the opposite. They really love being engineers, but they didn't like going to engineering school all that much. Yeah. So everybody's got their own thing that is unique to them, and that's kind of how it shook out for me.
So, and you also don't invest in mutual funds, right? You invest in the stock market.
Well, I have invested in mutual funds, but not at the moment. Mutual funds can be good if you don't know what else to invest in, if you can't think of anything else to invest in. Mutual funds are a pooling of a bunch of different investments.
Right.
And so they tend to kind of follow whatever a particular industry, usually they're focused on an industry or a particular angle, some kind of angle of investing.
Yeah.
It might be an international fund, it might be a real estate related fund, or it might be, like a utility fund or a tech fund, or just depends what the focus is.
And so how did you get to the point where you were smart enough to invest in individual businesses and these stocks and things?
Well, one of the things I did when I was in New York is I worked at an investment banking firm. And investment banking firms create investments basically in different companies. They structure investments. And so when I worked there, and it was for a brief time while I was still in school, I worked at a firm called Goldman Sachs, which has been it's been in the news a lot, and a lot of people from that firm have actually gone into the government and done different things. Like the Secretary of the Treasury came from Goldman Sachs.
Wow. Yeah.
And one of the governors of the Federal Reserve came from Goldman Sachs. It's a really interesting place full of a lot of really interesting people, and I learned a lot from working there, even though it was a short time that I worked there, about how investments are created, how they're structured. I learned a lot about the stock market, and that's what I studied in business school too. That's what my MBA is in finance, which focuses on basically finance, investing, corporate securities, that kind of a thing.
Awesome.
So there's a lot of theory that goes along with it. To study finance, you learn in business school, you learn about portfolio theory, you learn about the value of diversification, you learn the math of investing, returns on investment, and all that sort of thing, as well as corporate accounting.
Interesting. Cool. And then you also have invested in startups as well?
I have, yeah.
Has that kind of been because of your proximity as a business attorney with these different businesses?
Yes, usually. Usually. I have had the good fortune as a lawyer to be hired by a lot of startup companies to help them organize themselves and create all of the documentation that's necessary for them to be able to go out and solicit investments from other people. And that's a very highly regulated area. It's governed by what are called the securities laws. And as a business lawyer, and more specifically as a securities lawyer, I have the background to understand how that stuff works, and it's really helped me a lot in terms of understanding what might be a good investment, what might not be a good investment, what kinds of companies are going to run into trouble, legal trouble, by pursuing their business strategy.
And so what are some of those things you look for? What would the check marks be when you're like, this is a good company to invest in?
Well, boy, the list is very long. I mean, probably the very best thing to look for, there are two things that are super critical, I think. Number one is the management, the quality of the managers.
Right.
They have to be absolutely trustworthy and transparent.
Would you say that's number one?
And honest, yeah. Because if you're dealing with people that are not trustworthy, honest, and transparent, you can pretty much forget about the rest.
Yeah, not really worth it.
The business world is filled with opportunities for people who aren't trustworthy and straightforward and honest in their dealings to be able to do little things here and there that basically allow them to cause investments to go bad. And so looking for people who are good managers and are honest is right at the top of the list. And then I would say that the other thing is the market that they're in. The market is extremely important, because you could be the best paperclip manufacturer in the world and be really, really good and have a really good paperclip that's better than anybody else's paperclip. But the bottom line is paperclips are a commodity.
Right. And
the market for paperclips, I don't think, is huge. And so no matter how good you are at that business, that's just not a great business to be in. It's too commoditized.
Yeah.
And so you look for businesses where you can get an advantage over other businesses by knowing something or someone, or having a superior technology, or having some angle, sometimes people in business refer to it as barriers to entry. Mm-hmm. So if you want to be in a market that has high barriers to entry, maybe because you have a patent on your technology, or maybe because you have a supply source in a foreign country that no one else could get, or it could be any kind.
You're just more competitive. You can have that advantage.
Just a competitive advantage of some kind.
Yeah.
So good market, high barriers to entry, really knowledgeable management. Those are all things that are pretty much essential. Those don't guarantee that the company will be successful. Those are just necessary as kind of a starting point before you go on to analyze all the other things about the company.
Gotcha. And then you've got these aspiring entrepreneurs on the other side, where they're good, trustworthy people. They work hard, they're smart, and they've got a good business idea. What would you say to those people? What's kind of the blueprint to build a successful business?
Well, first, I think for someone, especially someone who's just starting out as an entrepreneur, young guy, like let's say you, for example, first thing is to really learn everything there is to know about either the product or the service or the market, more specifically, that you're going into.
Yeah.
So let's say you wanted to start a business as a DJ, for example. It would be very, very smart to go out and understand what the market for DJs is.
Yeah.
And try to get a sense somehow, and I don't know how you would do it actually for the market for DJs, but to try to get a sense for how often DJs are needed, what the market rate is for DJs, either an hourly basis, or if you can get a gig that is a flat fee of some kind, and try to get a sense for how often that is something that you could reasonably expect to be able to be hired to go do. If it's the kind of thing where, realistically, you could go out and market, and the only time you're going to get hired is maybe once a year for somebody's birthday or something, then, and I'm not saying that's the case, but just as an example, if that were the case, then maybe that market is not really large enough or attractive enough to justify spending all the time trying to develop it.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, that's the market part of it. And you're
right.
more of a commodity, kind of what you're saying with the paper clips.
Right. So there's understanding the market is very important, and then understanding how you're going to serve the market is also very important. So the market, typically people talk about the market in terms of market demand. How much demand is there
right.
for this product or this service? And then once you believe that the demand is really there, then it's good to try to analyze how you can serve that market and how you can serve it in a way that has a competitive advantage over other people that are trying to function in the same market. And when you figure that out, if you're in a great market and you are able to dominate the market, I mean, that's what business people dream about doing, is dominating the market, like the market for iPhones or for telephones, smartphones.
Very dominated.
Right? There's only a few, there's basically Apple and I think Samsung probably together account for, I'm just guessing, but I would suppose that they probably account for like maybe 60 or 70% of the entire market, right?
Right.
Between the two of them?
Yeah, I would think at least, yeah.
Yeah, so that's really good.
And something interesting about Apple is their profit margin is insane. It's like 70%.
Yeah, it's really big.
And so when you were talking about market demand, I thought Matt Harward was on the podcast before, and something he said, he's like, you're better off just going to the market directly and seeing what the pain points of the customers are, and then just building your business around that. Because if you're knowledgeable about something, but you're just going around and there is no demand for it, there isn't really a business there.
If there's no, like I said, if you could be the best paperclip guy in the world and have a paperclip that never rusts, that's perfect, that looks better than any other paperclip, but if nobody really wants to buy paperclips, it doesn't matter because there's no market demand, right? So that's true of a lot of things. Sometimes people, and I find this happening a lot with people that I work with, is they come up with a product and it's really cool. It really is neat what it does. But the problem is nobody really wants to spend any money to buy what they have.
Yeah. And
so there's no market demand, and if they can't fill a market demand, their product won't be successful. Their business won't be successful.
Right. Or sometimes maybe it's too early. Like they could have a cool product. Like I see a lot of people with the VR, the virtual reality.
Yeah.
Cool product. It's going to be there in the future, but people aren't just doing that, buying that right now. So there's a business right now, perhaps.
Yeah. Understanding the market is really, really, really important because sometimes people try to. You asked about mistakes. One of the mistakes that I think sometimes is very frequently made is people are trying to create a market. They're trying to get people interested in buying a product that they've come up with. Whereas the ideal scenario is people are already interested in buying it. They know they want something that will do whatever their product does.
Yeah, you don't need to inform them why.
You don't need to try to convince them that they want this product. All you need to do is come up with a really good product that serves the demand that already exists. And so that's a lot of what business is about.
All right, so we're talking about what to say to these aspiring entrepreneurs. I'm curious, like with you in your entire life, what would you say to your teenage self or to most teenagers out there? Look at, once again, with mistakes, what are those things to avoid and just overall advice?
Well, don't be afraid to make mistakes because everyone who has achieved anything has generally made a bunch of mistakes, and they've generally gone down a bunch of what you might call blind alleys, where they take a path and they realize that that something's not going to work. They thought it was going to work. They thought that conditions were such that all they needed to do was do A, B, and C, and they would be successful in a particular thing. And they later come to the conclusion that maybe it's not how they originally thought it was. And so they change course. So I would say, especially when you're young, don't be afraid. Number one, don't be afraid to work hard. Everybody that is going to be successful in whatever they do is going to have to work hard. So work hard. Don't be afraid to change course. Don't be afraid to take new information into account and go in a different direction, sometimes in a radically different direction, if you come to the conclusion that your original thinking was just on the wrong path. And don't be afraid to try lots of different things. We sort of talked about that earlier. Trying lots of different things is good because hopefully you learn from every experience you have.
Yeah.
And I have found that learning in one area generally carries over into lots of other different areas. And so learning is learning. And then I guess another thing I would say too is be very gregarious, be people-oriented, because no matter what an entrepreneur wants to do, they will have to work with lots and lots of people to achieve whatever it is they want to achieve. And so they need to have good people skills, they need to be relatable, they need to be, they're going to need to have a personality. In fact, I will give you a good example of something that I've always remembered. When I worked at Goldman Sachs in New York, the interviewing process was very rigorous, and we were brought in, everyone who was interviewing for a job usually was brought in multiple times and given several different people to interview with on different occasions. And some of the interviews lasted a long time. And after I was eventually hired, I learned that they have this thing there that they called the Tokyo test. And they called it the Tokyo test because it was based on the idea that they try to imagine sitting next to you on an airplane flying from New York to Tokyo, which is about a 13-hour flight. And they try to imagine what it would be like sitting next to you and talking to you for 13 hours. And whether by the end of the 13 hours, whether they would still think you were interesting or whether they would think that you were the dumbest guy they ever met, or whether they thought that you really had no potential you just bored them to death and you didn't have any potential to be an interesting conversationalist. So anyway, that's always stood out in my mind, the Tokyo test, as being the kind of thing where I sometimes try to imagine what it would be like to spend a lot of time sitting next to somebody, jammed into a seat, and whether by the end of that 13 hours I would find that person as interesting as they seemed originally.
So why do you think they did that? Why was that important?
Well, just because most businesses, and their business in particular, is a people business. And
so if you were going to be interesting with their clients and everything.
Absolutely. If you are going to be boring to them, you're probably going to be boring with clients that they serve, and they don't want to have people who are boring with clients that they serve. They want to have people who are energetic, who know a lot, who are really smart, who are really quick to understand facts and figures and situations and can grasp different ideas very quickly so that they can handle that business. And I would say most businesses benefit a lot from having people that are, why wouldn't you want somebody in your business who's smart, who's engaging, who's interesting?
And people like that, right?
And personable, right? So all of those things go a long way in business toward becoming successful. I suppose there are some professions where maybe that doesn't matter as much. Like say you're working in a laboratory or something, and,
right.
and you're mostly by yourself and you're working with a microscope or a computer or something, then maybe in that sort of a situation it's not as significant. But any kind of a people-oriented business, like the law certainly is that way. The finance world is that way, banking, or I would say healthcare is that way. People don't want to go in and meet with their doctor and have the doctor just kind of grunt and groan and not say anything to them when they're in there telling them that they've got a bad diagnosis or something. So,
yeah.
Yeah, it's important in almost every business.
So you talked about fear of failure and being okay with that. What do you think is the biggest thing that slows people down and stops them from, and well, causes them to fear failing?
I think they're self-conscious. It's the same kind of thing that, it has been said that the biggest fear that everyone tends to have is the fear of public speaking.
Right. Second to death.
Second to death. And taxes, maybe. And I suppose if that's true, and I suspect that it probably is, I would bet that it is the case because people feel like they're on display, that everyone is scrutinizing everything they say. And the cure for that, I think, is to just not really care, not really get worked up over what someone else thinks about you. You just need to be confident in yourself and just think that you're as good as anybody else. And we all make mistakes, and if we make mistakes, everybody can recover from mistakes. That's the wonderful thing about being human, is we all do make mistakes, and we all have the opportunity usually to recover from those mistakes. So I think in the business context, being confident in what you're doing and in your ability to do it is something that you gain over time. And when you've done something for a long time, hopefully you gain some confidence that you know how to do it correctly and you know how to avoid making serious mistakes. That's kind of the learning curve that everybody goes through. You've heard of probably the 10,000 hour rule.
Yeah, from Malcolm Gladwell.
Yeah. So so I'll repeat that for our viewers. The 10,000 hour rule is the idea that anything that is relatively complicated and requires a lot of focus generally can be mastered, so to speak, in a period of roughly 10,000 hours, which I guess if you generalize it and say 2,000 hours per year, which is roughly a 40-hour work week, 5 days a week for 50 weeks, right, with a 2-week vacation.
Yeah.
For 5 years of those kinds of weeks, that's 10,000 hours of focused effort to try to learn how to master that. And I think that makes a lot of sense, because if you look at law firms or if you look at residencies for doctors, they all tend to be somewhere in that range after people finish their formal training as in school and get their degree. Then they tend to go into an apprentice type arrangement. Doctors doing residencies is a good example. The residencies tend, I think, to be somewhere between 3 and 5 years. Sometimes they're longer because they have a fellowship or something, but it's somewhere in that ballpark of 10,000 hours of learning how to apply the book training that they received in school to practical applications. And so that's the basis for the 10,000 hour rule.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that's the answer to a lot of people. They think they can do things so fast,
right,
be successful overnight or even in a year, when you have to, like you're talking about mastery, it's going to take 5 dedicated years. Things take time to get better.
Well, right. There's a lot to know. And in fact, when you're in a profession that is complicated, regardless of what it is, whether it's architecture or dentistry or medicine or law or whatever, there's so much to know in any one of those professions that after you've actually learned it and after you've been doing it for many, many years, you kind of forget how you know those things. You just know them because you feel like you've always known them because you've been doing them so long.
Right.
But looking back, whenever I meet with people who are in law school or brand new lawyers and they ask questions, it reminds me that I was like that when I came out of law school, and there was a lot that I didn't know, and obviously there's a lot that I still don't know, but at least I know how to find out the things that I don't know. And I know how to get my arms around the things that I don't know and how to prevent the things that I don't know from interfering with the things that I need to do to be able to do my job well.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're 100% right. And when you're talking about the judgment of others, I think I totally agree. I think that's what slows people down is they're scared of what they're going to say. So, like if they wanted to post a podcast, for example, it takes longer for them to post because they're scared of each individual post.
Right.
What people are going to say, what they're going to think. When that's how you learn, you need to make those mistakes, and it takes time and experience. So the longer it takes, the longer it's going to take for you to learn it. It's just kind of a snowball effect there. And so I think you're right. If you have that confidence and are able to put yourself out there, I think you're actually able to learn faster.
Yeah, and I would say one other trait that I think is really valuable is just never, ever, ever give up. No matter how badly you mess something up, never quit, never say die, never stop trying, because you will eventually get it. Hopefully you'll get it sooner rather than later, but it might be later rather than sooner, and that's okay too.
Yeah. Have you had any experience with that where it took longer than you were expecting, or
well,
patience?
Yeah, I would say I think I told you that because I was very math and science oriented as an engineer, it was a difficult transition for me to transition from that to being a lawyer, to law school, because like I said, I was not I was very good in math and science, but I was not a very good writer when I started law school.
Right.
And it really took a lot of effort and a lot of correcting on the part of people that were reviewing my work to make me better at it. And so one of the things that I did when I graduated from law school and I joined a law firm, I had several partners in the law firm who were assigned to me to just give me tons and tons of work. So I worked like a maniac for the first 10,000 hours after I got out of school. And I had a lot of people giving me very, very nitpicky kinds of comments on every little thing that I did. And it was kind of annoying because I felt like I wasn't really ever doing anything right. But the good news is that because of that, I learned the real fine points of doing the things that are important to what I do. And it's really the only way to learn it, is to have somebody who's really good and really detailed going over every little thing and pointing out every little thing that you're doing wrong, so that you know why you're doing it wrong, what's wrong with it, and more importantly, you know how to do it right and how you can fix it so that the next time you don't make the same mistake. And that really matters a lot in a profession like mine. It might matter less in maybe other professions, but I think in law and certainly in medicine, it's good to have doctors looking over. My son is a doctor, and I've talked with him a lot about the process of going through the residency, where you've got a bunch of senior doctors kind of looking over your shoulder and making sure you don't really mess something up.
Yeah.
And it's a very good training ground because it keeps you on your toes and it forces you to learn the things that you really need to learn. And that's why those programs exist, is to really give excellent training. In some kinds of professions, it's more, training like that doesn't exist. You have to figure it out on your own, and everybody has a different style. And so you get, like in the arts world, I don't know all that much about the arts world, but my understanding is, or my impression is, that you have to figure a lot of things out on your own. You don't have people telling you what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong, because in a lot of ways there is no right or wrong. It's just kind of whatever works.
Yeah, so I think that's interesting because we talk about self-confidence. You need this high self-esteem to be able to, go forward and not listen to what other people are thinking or saying. But also on the other extreme, you need to have that humility to be successful in business, to learn from people who actually know more, experts, and learn from the market and what they're saying. Because if you've got that huge ego, you're going to drive your business into the ground, and I think in a lot of other things in life, because you don't have the ability to listen and to improve.
Absolutely. That's very critical in the professions in particular, to be able to listen and improve yourself, improve your performance.
Right. So tell us, do you have any like interesting, fun stories from the courtroom or in business negotiations?
I do. I have. I'll tell you one that I think is really kind of crazy. I was working on an acquisition in Mexico. This was a number of years ago, and
with Carlos Slim.
well, no, this was I'll tell you the background. It was a company based in Belgium that was purchasing. It had a U.S. company that it owned, based in Phoenix, and the U.S. company was buying a company in Mexico.
Okay.
And this company was in the chemical business. They made agricultural chemicals. And so they sent me to Mexico to work on the acquisition and to negotiate the acquisition of this company. And so I did that, and I was there for about a week working on this with the principals of the company that were buying the other company. And as we started interviewing the people in Mexico, we realized that these records that I talked about as being very important, although some of them did not exist, and others were kind of stored in boxes in the back room of the headquarters of the company. And so we started hauling all of these boxes out and going through all these documents, and we couldn't take them with us, and so we tried to see if we could copy them. And we were in a relatively small town, and the only thing that we could do, they didn't have any like Kinko, FedEx type places.
Yeah.
And so we ended up renting a copier machine, and we had thousands and thousands of pages of stuff that we had to copy, and we ended up having to do it one page at a time. So we hired a couple of people to make copies of this stuff. And when we finished, we had probably about 10 big boxes of documents, several thousand pages of documents. And I was somehow supposed to get these back to the United States, and I was planning to fly back to the United States, but all the planes were canceled out of the airport. There was a strike that forced all the airplanes to just sit on the ground. And we were in a big hurry to get all this stuff back, so I had to take a bus with all of these boxes of documents. And it was really funny because it was
a Mexican bus.
A Mexican
bus.
Those
are bumpy.
Bumpy bus. It had, pigs and chickens and stuff on the bus. And so I'm bumping along the road with all these banker boxes full of documents. I got to the border between Arizona and Mexico at about 1 o'clock in the morning, and I hand carried all of these boxes across the border. And so now, by the time I got through the customs agency, it was like 2 o'clock in the morning, and I ended up hitchhiking with all these boxes because I couldn't find anybody to take me. There were no buses, no taxis or anything. So I hitchhiked from the border, from Nogales to Tucson. I got to Tucson around 5 o'clock in the morning, and I was able to find somebody to drive me from Tucson to Phoenix. But it was such an ordeal to go through all of this, to bring all these documents back, to be able to work on this acquisition. And it's always stood out in my mind as being just one of those really funny things that happens to you, especially in foreign countries where they don't have all the same, at least back then, they didn't have all the same systems and, copy machines and Kinko, FedEx, places that just make it so easy to do, like we do. Things have changed a lot since then. I think they do have those things in this particular town now, but anyway, it kind of stood out in my mind.
Yeah, it's funny how you take those things for granted and you realize when you're in Mexico, oh, I can't do that.
Yeah.
How does one hitchhike? You just stay there with your thumb out?
Yeah.
Just wait for a car?
I did. 5 o'clock in the morning by the time I got to Tucson where these guys dropped me off. It was pretty funny.
That's crazy. That's funny. Okay, so we told you to give advice to the teenage self, but what would you say to the 30-year-old self? They've already graduated college. They're kind of in their, starting their career. What would you tell your 30-year-old self?
I would say make sure that you figure out a way, and I knew this at the time that I was 30 because I was an associate, that's a kind of a junior level lawyer in a law firm when I was 30. And I realized I was super focused on my career, and I was glad that I was, because I had to be in order to be on the path that law firms require in order to rise to the level of a partner, which I did. But I had a lot of challenges, like everybody does, balancing working really, really hard, long hours with also being a husband and a father. And I had, by this time, I had 2 children.
Okay.
And we later had 2 more children, so we have a total of 4. But by this time, I had 2 children, and it was just difficult to balance all those things. I'm not sure that I really could have done too much differently and still have achieved what I wanted to achieve business-wise. But I know my wife suffered during those years when I was, working till midnight, sometimes 3, 4, 5 days a week. I was working till midnight.
And when did you start the workday?
No, 9 a.m.
Okay.
But, I would come home and she'd be asleep, and we wouldn't have had any time together. We wouldn't have had dinner together. I wouldn't have seen my children until the next morning. And that was, I thought a lot over the years about how I could have done that differently or done that better. I'm sure I could have done it better and made it easier on her and less stressful on our children. But it's very difficult when you have all those work pressures on you, and especially when you're trying so hard to become recognized in your profession and trying to kind of build a following among the clients that hire you to do things and so forth. So that's a real challenge, and I guess I would just say to anyone who's thinking about following that path to make sure you don't overlook family commitments, church commitments. Don't let things get so out of balance that you fail to take care of your commitments. I saw an interesting video the other day, and it was Elder Bednar, and he was talking about this work-life balance thing.
Yeah.
And he said that balancing your life is a lot like what he called a Chinese acrobat, and by that he meant someone who puts play. He talked about people who, and you may have seen this on TV, maybe you've seen it live. These guys who put basically sticks or posts up in the air, and they put plates on them, and they spin them, and they get like 3 different plates going, and they're all spinning at the same time. And he made the analogy that those plates, especially if you have 3 of them, those plates are kind of like your work, your family, and your church commitments.
Right.
And he said that at any particular point in time, those plates are never going to be going at the same speed. The ideal thing is to have them be going permanently super fast, because if they're always spinning, they never are in danger of falling off. But he said the way that these guys keep them balanced is they have to put their hand on the rim of the plate and give it a little spin. And the plate will spin for a while, and then it will gradually start to slow down. And as it slows slower and slower, it is in danger of falling off. And so he analogized that to our lives. And he said, if you think that those 3 plates are kind of like your life, you realize that you can only do kind of one thing at a time. But the really critical thing is you can never let any of the plates fall off. So there will be times when you're doing more work and paying less attention to your family or paying less attention to church-related stuff. And that's when you're giving that work plate the extra spin.
Yeah.
And then once you finish spinning it and ramping it up to where it's going faster and it's stable, then you need to look at the other plates and see that they're slowing down and they're in danger of falling off, and so you need to give them a spin too. And the idea is that you need to always be mindful of the whole group and never let any of the plates fall off the stick that's holding it up. And I've thought about that, and I think it's a really good analogy, because you can't do everything all the time.
Right.
You have to focus more on one thing at the time you're focused on it. And then when you finish that, you need to move on and make sure that none of the plates fall off. So I thought that was a good image that's been helpful to me.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think people sometimes have the misconception. It's like, oh, I've got, whatever it is, 16 to 18 hours, got to do 6 hours family, 6 hours work.
Right.
Whatever. It's not that simple, and that's not how life works.
No.
Different times for different things.
No, there are going to be times when you're going to have to say no to any one of those things to be able to make sure that you give full attention to the other thing. But you have to make sure that you don't ever let things slow down so much that they crash in any one area. So I've thought a lot about that. I think it's a really good image and a good kind of metaphor for how we lead our lives. And I also, looking back, I mean, I'm happy that I don't think I've had any crashes.
No plates falling?
I don't think I've had any plates fall off. I think I would have heard about them from somebody by now if one of the plates had fallen off. So
amidst all the plates spinning, how do you stay motivated? What keeps you going, and what made you want to be so ambitious with your career?
I feel like I'm very mindful of time, and I realize that we only have a certain amount of time. And
on Earth, you're saying?
Right, on Earth, yeah. Our lives are finite. They may be anywhere from, well, I mean, some people unfortunately become ill and they die younger than they thought they were going to, and they die prematurely. And in those cases, they have even less time than most people ordinarily think they're going to have. Mm-hmm. The average male lifespan in the United States, I think, is something like 77 years or so.
Okay.
And so if you take that as a rough guide, let's just say 80. If you assume that you're going to live 80 years, you'll probably live longer because you were born later and
I'm going for 200.
Lifespans have been going up. 200 would be good. But let's just say 80 for the sake of discussion. That seems like a long time, but really it's not, because it goes very, very quickly. And if you spend, as we discussed earlier, if you spend 10,000 hours learning how to master something, you've already spent 5 out of those 80 years just becoming good at doing something.
Yeah.
When you think that you've got school and you've got all the time that you want to spend with your family and everything else, it leaves you a relatively short number of years to focus on doing something that's interesting and productive and hopefully will benefit other people and hopefully will outlive you. That's another thing that is nice, is to think of doing something that will outlive you and kind of be a contribution to the world. I'm thinking more about that than I ever have, because now my children are grown and they are on their own. I'm not spending time raising children, they're already raised. I'm thinking more and more about other things, like, for example, church-related stuff. I'm spending a fair amount of time doing things in the church, and I really, really enjoy that, and I feel like it's a contribution. And I also am doing more things professionally to kind of give back. I've been mentoring some law students, and I am an arbitrator in cases, and there's just a lot of things that you can do.
In what other ways do you think you're able to have that legacy, and how important do you think really it is overall to be in a career or a business that really blesses people's lives, that's a benefit to them?
Well, I think if you can get into a career that does good for other people, chances are you'll be a lot more satisfied with that kind of a career.
Yeah.
And most careers have some element of that, and even if they don't seem directly like they do, there are always opportunities to kind of step outside just the thing that you might do on a day-to-day basis and contribute more to. You might become involved in charitable activities, you might volunteer at a food kitchen, you might get involved in some sort of a youth project where you're trying to help kids stay out of trouble. There's all kinds of things around the valley that are charitable groups that are really worthwhile, and I've been involved in doing some of those things too, and that's been really very, very stimulating, very, very productive, and really produces a feeling of having given back to the community, which I like.
That's awesome. Have you ever thought about writing a book?
I have. Yeah, I want to make sure that I have a topic that I'm just super in love with before I do that.
Because it takes a lot of time, right?
Because it takes a lot of time, and I don't want to do it. I don't want to write a book. I mean, I've written enough material as a lawyer to have written a whole bunch of books. Because like I said, lawyers just write all the time. And I don't want to write something unless I think it's really meaningful and will be meaningful to a lot of other people. So I keep searching kind of for the ideal topic, and so far I haven't landed on it. But when I do, I'll write that book.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about doing a book. It would be cool with all the podcasts that I'm doing, getting these life lessons from different people and compiling it. I think that'd be interesting.
That would be interesting. That'd be really good.
Have you been involved in public speaking at all, other than just, because I know as a lawyer there's a lot of that, and with people, what other kind of experience did you have with that?
As part of my career, I've been a lobbyist for a few things.
Really?
Do you know what lobbyists do? So I have gone to the Arizona legislature and lobbied, spoken to committees of the legislature in favor of trying to get certain laws adopted. I have, done a lot of public speaking in church. I've done a lot of court appearances where you go to court and basically you are speaking to the judge, trying to convince the judge to take your position, to accept your position on a particular issue that is before the judge for consideration. I've been involved in a few trials from start to finish.
Okay.
And all of that is, of course, very public speaking, where you're talking to, you're trying to persuade the judge or the jury to believe in your client's position so that they will make a favorable finding. That's probably the bulk of it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting when you kind of just started describing it. It's like, well, that's how important communication is. Because if you want something to happen, you want to convince people to, or spread good out there, you need to be able to communicate, and in large groups as well.
Yep. Yeah, very, very good to have communications training and background, and to have public speaking skills and writing skills is really, really, really good, really critical.
Awesome.
And that's one of the things, like I said, that kind of led me to law school, because lawyers tend to focus on both of those things.
And that was appealing to you.
Very appealing to me, to be able to become better trained and more polished in both of those areas.
Amazing. All right, well, some takeaways from the podcast. If you have a business, make sure you're taking those records, because our attorney Scott over here might get a little frustrated at you. And it's also going to run into trouble. So yeah, take care of the bookkeeping, the records, everything. Also, try new things. Even if you think you're too old or you already have it figured out, try something new that is exotic, you've never done before. You never know what it tastes like until you taste it.
That's right.
Plates, the spinning plates. Make sure you get a good look at your different plates in life, which means important things that you're doing, your family, your career, your business, your church service, and responsibilities there. It won't be a perfect balance at all times, but make sure you're doing your best, and there's different times for different things, but make sure your priorities are straight. What are your thoughts on priorities? How do you kind of line those up?
Well, my priority is my religious beliefs and my family are both right at the top of the list, and everything else is secondary. My career is secondary to that now. There was a time, like I said earlier, where when I was kind of right out of school and I was trying to focus on rising up through the profession, when I really had to, in some cases, make that a higher priority, not higher than my family, but just I had to make it a priority where, unless something really important was going on with my family, I would tend to have to focus on work, or else I wasn't going to be able to achieve what I needed to achieve to be able to rise to the level that that everybody aspires to when they become a lawyer, which is people who join private law firms are very focused on becoming a partner in the law firm. That is kind of it's just sort of a rite of passage in a lot of ways, where people are very focused on it. And So I was very focused on it, and I achieved what I wanted to achieve. And fortunately, it didn't kill me, and it didn't cause me to get divorced, and it didn't cause me to lose the affections of any of my children. So I think I would look at that, and I think most people look at that and say, well, you pretty much got out of it what you hoped to get out of it.
That's success right there.
Yeah, I mean, everybody has a different way of measuring success, and it's important to understand what you value yourself and what you consider to be your own measure of success. Some people don't value getting married, don't value having a family, and their highest value is on having lots and lots of connections and being very well known in a particular professional community. And that's what matters to them, and that's okay for them. I mean, everybody gets to set their own priority. But my priorities have always included having a family that I was very close to. And fortunately, after all these years, my family is still very, very close and very kind and very loving, and we have a great relationship, and I couldn't be happier with the way that's all worked out.
That's amazing. So do you feel like that motivates you more because of your family and as far as like fulfillment and all that?
Well, yeah, it's very satisfying to know that that having been at this now 32 years since I graduated from law school, that the things that I set out to do, I've largely finished. One of the things that I haven't finished, and you asked about it, was writing a book. I do want to write a book. And like I said, as soon as I find the topic, which I think about a lot, as soon as I find the right topic, I'll do that too.
That's awesome. Well, I'll make sure to promote it.
Yeah.
To read it.
Perfect.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Scott.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
taking the time.
Enjoyed it.
All right. We'll see you guys next time.